Thanks, Sarah, and thank you, Jen. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm so grateful that you guys invited me, and thank you all of you all for coming. I'm really looking forward to this. So I'm going to share my screen with a slideshow, and then we'll get started. All right. Here we go. As Jen and Sarah noted, I've done a lot of work with eels in medieval and pre-modern England, and this talk is not about eels. This talk is about maps, but I will throw in a pitch for eels. If you don't know anything about medieval, pre-modern, early modern eels, you should learn because it's really cool. It's a fascinating subject. But like I said, that's not why I'm here today. I'm here to talk about maps. And in a way, this is sort of me going back to my roots. I did my dissertation on eels, but I started with maps. I'm at heart a map historian. I'm fascinated by the ways that people imagine and reproduce the world around them. And I really enjoy trying to piece together a better understanding of the past from the clues I can find in historical maps. Like I said, the study of maps led me to eels, but also to other projects, including this one. And this is me sort of trying to get a better handle on how medieval people understood the world around them and thought and used maps to do it. So kind of trying to get a sense for what medieval cartographic imagination might have looked like. And a couple of kind of caveats before I get going. My sense from people I've talked to is that this is going to be kind of a mixed audience with some medievalists and some not. So I'm not going to take any knowledge for granted. And if I spend a couple extra minutes on something that feels pretty basic to you, give me a little patience and I'll get past it. And also, I'd like to note that this is really very much a kind of work in process project. I'm working with some ideas about textual and mental mapping that I've done some work with my colleague Anna Waymack, but I haven't been doing it for a while. And so this is me kind of taking the opportunity to go back and get my sort of self dug back into this topic. But as I said, I haven't been here for a while. And so I hope you'll excuse kind of any rough edges as I go. That said, let's go. Yeah, so maps. We use them all the time. We live with them. We carry them around with us. We live in a really map literate society. We use them to find our way across the world, to think about political spaces, to make claims about property and identity, and we use them to divide up areas of academic study sometimes too. Our phones, we carry them around with us all the time, and they make maps of our travels, and companies use that information to try to sell us things. Maps are a really deeply integrated part of our modern culture. But that kind of broad map literacy, where we sort of use maps so much we take them for granted, that's a fairly modern phenomenon. But looking at the way we deal with maps, it makes me wonder, what about other people in other times? What about medieval people? What role did maps play for them? And my contention here, what I'm going to talk about today, is that I think medieval people thought cartographically a lot more than we might imagine. That maps of the world, or mappa mundi, is mostly what I'm going to be dealing with today, were broadly culturally important. But these look different than the maps we know, and medieval people use them differently and for different reasons. These weren't maps for navigation. You couldn't find your way across the globe or really across town with them. They're maps for teaching. They're maps for teaching history and moral geography, and they're maps to aid in memory and in thought. So let's start with what they look like. How do they work? It said these are mappa mundi. It's Latin for a map of the world, and that term covers a really broad range of kind of descriptions of the world and images of the world, but they have some similar governing principles. There we go. So here's a really nice, pretty one from the 15th century, and it sort of hits a lot of the really generic parts about mappa mundi. It's showing you a spherical world, sort of looking down at it from on top. It's divided into three basic land masses: Europe, Africa, and Asia. Sometimes there's a fourth one if the map maker wanted to put the Antipodes on there, but there's usually three. There's and usually the land masses are surrounded by sort of an encircling ocean. So most of the time, not always, most of the time, medieval mappa mundi are oriented with east on top. East is the top of the map, which is in fact where we get the word oriented. And as a rule, they don't really care a lot for geographic accuracy, at least not as we understand the term. It's not the point. Their purpose is to be didactic. They teach lessons about Christological history. They give an account of humanity as biblical story, kind of. And this map's pretty basic, but even here, you've got Noah's Ark sitting there on top of Mount Ararat, and then Noah's 3 sons, each of which sort of settles a continent, Europe, Africa, and in Asia. So even on sort of more basic maps, you sometimes see this Christological history. Here's a more complex map. It's sort of one of the most famous medieval mappamundi. It's a 13th century Hereford map, and it's the largest surviving mappamundi we have. It's just chock full of, it's hard to see from this picture, but it's chock full of images and stories and sort of geography and history and all kinds of things. And it's explicit about its purpose. The map contains a note from its author explicitly calling itself a history. And it offers a stage space where all of humanity's story can unfold. This is a history that moves geographically as well as chronologically. It starts, human history in sort of the medieval imagination starts in the East with paradise, which often shows up on medieval maps. And it moves westward down the map, right, through the Tower of Babel, and then to Jerusalem. We have Jesus' crucifixion, and then on to Rome and to the western part of the world. As you go through time, you move geographically through the map. And the center of this history and this geography in many maps, medieval maps, is the Holy Land, kind of this area right here, which is often really sort of outsized on medieval maps because it's got a lot of, it's important, so it's big, and they've got a lot of events to jam in there, so they make it bigger than it sort of would be on a map that's geographically accurate. This is where some of the most important events take place, biblical events in the Old and New Testament. And very often medieval mappamundi put Jerusalem and the Holy Land right in the middle of the world, sort of as the physical center of the earth. It's a cartographic aesthetic driven by story, and accuracy here takes a real back seat, sometimes multiple seats back. And there's a lot more on these maps than just biblical stories, though. The complex maps like this are sort of acting as a visual encyclopedia. There's biblical tales and hagiographies and classical mythology and received history and Isidorian truths and all kinds of things that just sort of get thrown on there. It's a graphic, a map like this is a graphic palimpsest of overlaid historical moments that compresses all of the past into a single visual space. And it's an archive of universal knowledge set on a global frame. Hugh of St. Victor wrote that maps and texts like them should create a brief summary of all things that the mind can grasp and the memory can retain with ease. But even though they're compiling information from all of these different places, like a sort of like an encyclopedia, they're still telling a story within the broader context of a Christian timeline. Mappamundi such as Hereford here, excuse me, some mappamundi like a Hereford map here also include an image of the final judgment, which is up here on this map. And so they get to teach the entire arc of Christian history from paradise to damnation or salvation, take your pick, depends on what kind of person you are, I guess. So all in all, the goal here is didactic and moralizing. The territory of the map is itself an education. And so a map like this is meant to teach, but who is it meant to teach? Most of the graphical mappamundi that we're familiar with, Hereford and some of the others, they're specialty items. They're housed in monasteries, like the Hereford map here, or set in really richly illuminated personal books, like this Psalter map from the 13th century. These maps they're status symbols, and they're just available to a handful of people. So only the real elite get to look at the world like this. But it would be a mistake to think that this meant that only the elite had access to maps of the world, because as it turns out, mappamundi, they come in a lot of different forms. Sometimes they're textual. So this is a map. I know it doesn't look like one, but it tells you it's one. It says they're right up at the top. It says it's a map of the world. And it's by Gervase of Canterbury. He's a 12th century English monk, and he included it at the back end of one of his chronicles. And it's a prose map, which was actually a thing. You see them relatively frequently. Medieval chronicles often include some kind of textual map, very often at the front, where they give a description of the territory that they're about to sort of describe and place their history in. So modern readers sometimes miss that this is actually functioning as a map, this sort of part of the text, because we're used to thinking about maps just as a visual experience. But medieval maps could operate in a lot of different ways, including like this. And we see these sort of textual maps sometimes sort of understated at the beginning of histories like Bede's Ecclesiastical History, or works of William of Malmesbury, or Henry of Huntingdon, or Matthew Paris, people like that. But sometimes they're a lot more explicit, like Gervais here calling his block of text a mappa mundi, and Ranulph Hingdon does the same thing with this Polychronicon. The whole first book of the Polychronicon is called a map. It's a mappa mundi. It's a map of the world. These kind of textual maps, they're all different, but they do share some common traits. They describe geographies, they name places, and they give the reader a physical space to imagine. And that's important. They offer a stage for the history that's about to happen, or in Gervais's case here, that happened before. And it's useful for the same reason that the visual maps are useful, because tying narrative to imagined place helps cement the story and the place in your memory. And once those memories are in place, sort of settled into a physical location, imagined physical location, then the map itself can become kind of a mnemonic container. Medieval culture was really memorial, and trained memory needed sort of an imagined physical space that we might call a memory palace. But it doesn't have to be a palace. You can use a lot of different things, including a map. So to remember a piece of information, you visualize sort of setting it in a location, a locus or sedes, in a place or a seat. And you sort of do this as you find new information, as you're reading a text or learning something. You sort of mentally attach it to a physical place. And like I said, you can use maps for this. It doesn't have to be a building, like a palace. And so from sort of these kind of maps, we get a sense that, okay, so maybe there's more people thinking about maps and thinking cartographically than just were sort of able to look at maps like the Salter map or the Hereford map. So we expanded the field a little bit, and they're using them for a purpose. They're using them to sort of think about the world and then use it for their own ends. But we're still talking really small numbers here, even though works like Higdon's Polychronicon were pretty popular. But we can expand our sort of range of people thinking about maps a little bit further still, because it wasn't just chronicles that sort of use textual maps to help set their stage. Other types of text could be maps too. One of the sort of best examples of this is the 14th century travels of Sir John Mandeville, which is a fictionalized account of a knight's travel sort of journey from England to Jerusalem and then onward eastward to the gates of Eden. And the book details the routes and the sites along the way. The travels is a weird text. It sometimes reads like a romance, and it sometimes reads like an itinerary, and it feels very stitched together. But what it really is a map. It's a map of the world. It takes the reader from one edge of the world all the way to the other, facing eastward the whole time. It sets Jerusalem very squarely in the center of not just its story, but its actual, like, if you pick up a manuscript of Mandeville's travels, Jerusalem will almost always be right smack dab in the center, sort of exactly where it would be on the map you might look at. And the Mandeville author fills his world with the same content that gives flesh to the bones of these visual maps. He describes the elements in vibrant terms that render them visible to the mind in geographic space. And it's sort of operating in the same way that we were talking about a second ago. These sort of vivid descriptions of space and events and monsters and all kinds of things gives you, as a reader, something to hang your own set of memories on. It lets you use the map that the book gives you as the mnemonic container. And the more vivid the images are, the better they act as loci for storage. And in this way, the world itself becomes a memory palace for you. And this is a really old idea. Augustine talks about this. He describes his memory as the world in microcosm, as sort of a tangible place where he can keep and store things, memories and ideas and things. And there's some evidence that that readers of Mandeville's Travels use the book for this purpose as well. Christine de Pizan in her Path of Long Study is really explicit about the fact that she's using Mandeville's book to help create a mental world that then she sort of walks through over the course of her dream vision. So the book gives her the world to sort of explore and hang her memories and ideas on. So the Travels was really popular. We have more than 300 surviving manuscript copies, which is about double what we have for manuscript copies of Marco Polo. And they belong to a really wide range of readers, from people like Christine de Pizan, sort of at the highest echelons of court society, all the way down to we know there were copies owned by merchants' apprentices and people like that. So a really broad range of people. That the Travels was translated again and again and again. It was adapted into poetry. There's a really cool sort of graphic novel version of it that was done in Bohemia. So it's popular and widespread. And that means that, again, we sort of expanded the group of people who are cartographically literate in some ways, who are using images of the world to think with. But I said at the top that I thought that Map-O-Mundi were broadly important and that a lot of people thought cartographically through them. And so far, even though Mandeville was a popular book, we're still talking about a fairly small range of people, pretty small subset of the population. But what about everybody else? About sort of the common everyday people who weren't, spending their time reading romances or chronicles or travel logs? Well, they got their maps from other places. And this brings us to the Castle of Perseverance. Here it is. So Castle is a 15th century English morality play, and it comes from the area around Lincoln. It's one of the longest medieval plays we have extant. It clocks in at almost 3,650 lines. I think it's 3,649. And if you did a full length performance of it, it would take about 3.5 hours. So it takes a while. It's a commitment. And the play, it tells the allegorized story of human history through the actions of its main character, called Mankind. So the play starts with his birth and ignorance, and then it tracks mankind's sort of self-determined expulsion from the protection of a holy place. And then it sees him tempted into a life of worldly excess by personification of various earthly sins. If you don't know how medieval morality plays work, this is kind of what you get. You get sort of big allegorical characters: mankind, lust, gluttony, things like that. So over the course of the play, mankind eventually finds salvation through the passion of Christ, but then in his old age, he sort of succumbs to temptation again, to the temptation of greed. And then right as he does, he's struck down by death before he can repent, and then he has to wait for the final judgment. So the sort of story goes from sort of birth to final judgment of the character. And because it's sort of a broad allegory, what we're talking about really here is sort of the story of human history and Christological history. So from creation to end times. And like a lot of morality plays, Castle offers its audience a really fun cast of characters, an enjoyable story this one has sort of temptation, fall, and redemption, and a lot of humor. But Castle is unique because it offers something that just about no other medieval play gives us, which is stage directions. Oh, wrong way. Yep. And here we go. So let's take a look at the staging, which is what we're looking at right here. In the center, you have the castle itself. And then this is the space where mankind is born and gets saved by Jesus and eventually dies. Around the castle, sort of within the circle, you have the platea, which is the stage essentially where most of the action of the play takes place. The characters wander around from one part of the platea to the other. Surrounding the platea, you've got this sort of circle, and that's a ditch. It's supposed to be a ditch which, if possible, should be filled with water. And if you can't do that, you're supposed to build some sort of barrier around it, like with hurdles or something. And then on the outside of the ditch, there are 5 towers or scaffolds, each one of which houses one of the play's main allegorical personifications. So 4 of these are aligned with cardinal directions. To the east is the Tower of God, and we'll talk more about these in a moment. To the east is the Tower of God, to the west is the Tower of the World, to the south is the Tower of Flesh, which sounds kind of gross, and the north is the Tower of Belial, the devil. And the last tower sits in the northeast, right in between God and the devil, and this is the Tower of Covetousness or Avarice. So the diagram sort of lays all this out. It gives some costuming instructions, which are a lot of fun. The devil apparently is supposed to have gunpowder that's burning in pipes that he has in his hands and in his ears and in his pants. So he's got smoke coming out everywhere. And it gives directions for dealing with the audience as well. So one of the things that the diagram here tells us is that playgoers are not supposed to sit on the actual structure of the castle itself because they get in the way of the view. And that the platea itself shouldn't have too many staff members sort of going around being busy with crowd control. So now it's not at all certain what the play looked like in practice. Some historians think that because of those set of instructions about not sitting on the tower and the crowd control, that audience members were actually allowed onto the platea, and then the play sort of happens in the middle of the audience, essentially. Modern reenactors have really shied away from that because it gets in the way of the action of the play, and it's really disruptive. And so have instead pushed the audience to the outside of sort of off the platea. Here's an example done from 1979 where you can see the everybody's sort of away from the action that's happening all around the castle in the middle. So there's a lot of disagreement about it. Nobody really knows kind of what it looks like. And nobody knows quite how literally to take the diagram itself, whether it's more schematic or whether it's actually meant to be sort of realistic. My personal inclination is I would like to take the diagram at its word to allow the audience onto the platea and to have the sort of the ditch all the way around it. And I'll explain why as we get a little further on here. But the fact of the matter is that nobody has a real good idea one way or the other. Right. So in any event, this diagram of the stage, it reproduces a schematic mappa mundi. The platea, the round stage for human action here, is the earth. The ditch with its water is the encircling ocean. And the central tower where mankind is redeemed is Jerusalem. Now, a fair number of scholars have noted this sort of this similarity, these structural similarities, but that's sort of where attention to this is mostly stopped. And I think that's unfortunate because it's not just the staging that mimics mappa mundi structures. The allegorized characters, the drama mirror the map's moral geographies, and the play, like a mappa mundi, uses this space to layer time and to tell the story of universal history. And following from the rationale of the genre, Castle of Perseverance is a piece of didactic mapping. It accesses the audience's existing archives of knowledge that to not only reflect, but also to teach lessons about geography, history, and global space. And the connection between the drama and the map are not inconsequential. Taken together, the diagram and the play's text suggest that the entire performance can and perhaps should be understood cartographically. The play essentially creates a living map. Now, of course, Castle of Perseverance is a morality play. It's supposed to be didactic. It preaches microcosmic lessons about sin and redemption and sort of big bore allegorical stories about mankind's march from Eden to judgment. But the play also gives its audience a cartographic education to help make this broader moral tale stick. Like the Hereford map or Mandeville's travels, Castle uses the geography of the world to provide the loci and the sedes for mnemonic recall. And it expects its audience to understand. Castle makes no overt claims to this purpose. The staging directions here are explicit about the towers being assigned to north, south, east, and west. But the play itself does not. Doesn't say anything about directionality or geography. Audience members are sort of left to their own devices to understand that the platea with its surrounding moat stands for the world, and that the characters represent not just moral types, but also moral geographies. But the playgoers likely possessed enough background drawn from a compost of cultural memory and basic religious education to recognize at least some of the play's actions as geographical. The play leverages those understood connections along with its audience members' likely familiarity with some local history to give playgoers a cartographic vernacular that could help them learn and recall the play's lessons. So several of the set's locations would have been fairly easy for a late medieval English audience to align with broader global geographies. So God's Scaffold, which is over here on the left side of the map, located in the east of the Plataea, would have been probably the easiest. As David Woodward has noted, European Christianity really has long looked to the East as a source of holiness, and by the medieval period, the East as an idea had developed a deeply understood mythical characteristics. The Book of Genesis puts paradise in the East, and so did Isidore of Seville. Closer to home, for Castle's audience, Bede, in his ecclesiastical history, tells a really interesting dream story that somebody related to him, where the dreamer finds himself walking towards the rising sun, and in front of him is heaven. As he goes further along and gets closer and closer to the heavenly kingdom of God, and to his left, first he sees sort of a purgatory, and then he sees the actual entrance to hell. But he's able to sort of push past those and go almost all the way up to the gates of heaven. So heaven is towards the rising sun in the east, and purgatory is off to his left-hand side. So the east here is the direction of God and holiness, and this has sort of textual and more sort of lived experience, right? Excuse me, most English audiences at the turn of the 15th century would have probably been able to recognize the location of God's Scaffold as replicating a known moral geography. And so that's probably the easiest one to get, and if nothing else, could have provided kind of a key for understanding the rest of what's going on with the geography of the play. The second most recognizable geographical feature of the stage would probably have been the castle itself. It's situated right in the middle of the Plataea. It takes up the space that Jerusalem usually does on a map, and the audience would have probably come to the play with a fairly high level of cartographic literacy about this one point at least. Jerusalem was widely considered to be the physical center of the world, sort of the navel of the earth. And much of the action of the Bible takes place around Jerusalem as a central point. Jesus died and rose again there. And from the 11th century onward, these sort of waves of crusaders, even though they failed to in their main objective, one of the things that they did do was sort of focus European attention on Jerusalem and the Holy Land as sort of the center of European geographic imagination. So this is the background that the play's audience is coming to the play with, and it's quite likely that they would have sort of understood the tower in the middle as reproducing Jerusalem. And the action of the play here sort of underlines this association, teaches the morality of the space. The drama uses the physical castle as a base to reenact the passion of Christ and the salvation of mankind. So after his life of sort of succumbing to the sins of the world, mankind retreats to the tower and is sort of accepts Christ, and then is attacked by the 7 deadly sins who tried to besiege the tower, and they are driven off by the 7 virtues, who beat them back with a shower of red roses, which is a fairly common symbol for Christ's sacrifice and his blood. So in the story then, late in life, mankind finds redemption through the passion of Christ in a fortress in the center of the world. And a medieval English playgoer, I think, would have been fairly hard-pressed to not understand this overlaid geography. The scaffold in the west here belongs to Mundus, or the world. And Mundus's role in the play is to tempt and corrupt mankind, which he does with the help of avarice. Like the preceding 2 spaces, dramatic spaces, this is a moral geography that would have been fairly easy for the play's audience to understand, I think. The scaffold stands at the opposite cardinal point from the scaffold of God, which suggests a conflict in geography right off the bat. The location of sort of the sinful and tempting Mundus is in the west, and that also aligns with the Europeans' Christian sense of their place in the world's moral geohistorical arc. They believe themselves to be living at the very end of history, struggling through the last few days of a fallen world. And this is not just a function of time, but also a function of place. You recall earlier I said that history moved geographically, beginning in the east and ending in the west, and you couldn't get much further west than England. English people understood themselves to be living at the edge of the map, both literally and figuratively, and that meant that they were about as far west as history could go, sort of living at the end of the world, waiting for the end of the world. And so the Tower of Mundus here is sort of replicating something that they live on a fairly regular basis. The other 2 cardinal points, north and south, are likewise sort of represented by characters in action that reflect and teach basic moral geographies. The statue in the north belongs to the devil, the devil, excuse me. And as an imagined space, the North has sort of long stood as barbarous and uncivilized. It's sort of far from Jerusalem or Rome or London, places of sort of culture or faith. And Europeans have really for a long time identified the North in opposition to the East. A lot of European languages have a very long tradition of referring to North as being left of East. So if you're facing East, North is to your left, which makes it literally sinister direction. And we saw this in Bede's dream vision of the guy. He's walking towards paradise, but purgatory and hell are on his left to the north. So there's a pretty long textual tradition here too, not just a popular one. The book of Isaiah notes that Lucifer wanted to sit on the mount of the congregation on the sides of the north, and Augustine paraphrased this, saying that the devil wanted to set his throne in the north and be like God. This discussion of the north from Augustine laid a foundation for later's association of the north with Lucifer. Alfred Kellogg has argued that Augustine's sense of moral geography found a clear echo in Langland's Piers Plowman, with Satan claiming that he would place his foot, his pedem, in the north instead of his throne, his sedim. So by the time you get to, there's a bunch of other examples as well, but by the time you get to Castle, it's the idea that the north is sort of associated with evil and the devil is fairly well ingrained. And across the platea from the devil, you have the tower of flesh that tempts mankind with all kinds of carnal delights. And here again, the play maps a morality onto the world. The South, as an imagined geographic space, has this real long association with Black sexual morality. It's a place where the climate and morals blur the lines between people and beasts. It's where a lot of medieval map makers put monsters and half-human monstrous peoples. So here, the Salter map we looked at earlier sets them here on the left-hand side in Africa. Here's a better view of that. The South is a place with an intense heat and sun that was thought to change people's skin color and the morality. And this idea really outlasted the Middle Ages. It formed part of the basis for this orientalizing perception of indolence and sexual promiscuity among indigenous people in the South Pacific and other equatorial places. And the idea that this sort of climate could affect visitors. So you weren't, just because you were from Europe didn't make you safe. If you went to one of these places, you might in fact wind up tempted by, well, I think the author of the Castle play here would say you're tempted by the Tower of Flesh. So it's fairly dangerous. The last tower here, the Tower of Avarice, is in some ways I think the most interesting. It's the avarice plays a really pivotal role in the play. After mankind's salvation, 6 of the 7 deadly sins attack him in the tower and try to overcome it with force, but they can't. And then Mundus goes to Avarice and asks him for help. And Avarice, rather than attacking the castle, just goes and talks to mankind and tempts him with money and the easy life that it could provide him. And then as soon as mankind accepts that offer, he's struck down by death and has to wait to see what happens at the final judgment. And the location of the tower is really interesting. It's the only tower of the 5 that is located in an ordinal point on the compass. It's not a cardinal point. It doesn't have an opposite tower or a scaffold across the way from it. And there's not an obvious connection to principles of moral geography. Victor Scherb has suggested that the scaffold here is acting to try to displace East as a cardinal point on the moral compass, with Avarice contesting with God to define the boundaries of mankind's ethical world. So sort of it's acting like a false East. But if you think about the scaffold's location in relation to the visual mapamundi that we've been looking at earlier, there's a different rationale at play, I think. The stage layout here indicates, sort of tells the audience that the scaffold houses a very specifically Jewish threat. And it connects to sort of a broader universal history yet again. When you align the castle's diagram with the geography we find on visual maps, what you wind up with, you find is that it's basically sitting exactly where you would find the kingdoms of Gog and Magog on a map like the Salter map here. So Gog and Magog, they appear in the Book of Revelations as the enemies of God's chosen people, and they're going to sort of show up at the end times and wreak havoc. But over the course of the Middle Ages, writers and map makers came to associate the people of Gog and Magog very specifically with the Jewish people, with the lost tribes of Israel. The 13th century chronicler Matthew Paris wrote on his map of the Holy Land that in the northeast, enclosed behind the Caspian Mountains, there dwelt, quote, the Jews whom God locked up at the request of King Alexander. And this becomes a really popular idea, this idea that you have this sort of the group of Jewish people locked behind the mountains, often with sort of Alexander having done the locking. And they're sort of waiting for the end times to come out and kill us all, basically. So yeah, you can see them there sort of on the Salter map. And this is really the only place, this sort of section in the Northeast. They show up on a lot of Mappamundi, the Gog and Magog. And this is the only place on Mappamundi that's sort of consistently dedicated to Jewish people at all. Often they don't show up at all. But other than here, as sort of this eschatological threat. And so, excuse me. So this is sort of little bit of Armageddon geography here. And when we look back at the castle diagram, we said that this is exactly the same place where we find Avarice's tower. And Avarice here is in charge of greed and money lending. And in fact, it's money lending that Avarice uses to sort of tempt mankind out of his tower at the end. So it's a little less obvious, but there's still a morality to the space, just like the others. Now, it's likely that Avarice's actions and nature alone would have been enough for the audience to make this connection to Judaism. But the play goes a step further, actually, to sort of make this point. I'm sorry, it sort of relies on local history and spatial knowledge to drive the point home. After gluttony, sloth, and lechery have all been beaten back from the play's central tower, Mundus turns to Avarice and asks him to continue the assault on man. And part of this cajoling, he sort of makes this threat. And here it is. Here I've given it in sort of the original and in a translation. Translation says he's going to offer him a reward, and the reward is that he's going to hang him on the gallows of Kenwick anew, and that would be the right thing to do. So, excuse me. So this threat of a new hanging seems odd to us on its face, but it would have struck a real chord of memory with the play's Lincolnshire audiences. Walter Smart has identified the Kenwick here with Kenwick Hill, which is just south of Lincoln. And in 1255, Kenwick Hill played host to the very famous hanging of 18 Jews in revenge for the sort of notorious murder of the 8-year-old Hugh of Lincoln, who later went on to become the sort of pseudo-saint, Little Saint Hugh. Kenwick saw other executions in its day, but the 1255 ones were by far the most notorious and the most clearly remembered. And a Lincolnshire audience, and this is a Lincolnshire play, would have understood that connection. So the mention of Kenwick here is operating as a locus for memories, of sort of throwing out a physical space with an attached story that they know, that can then be used to leverage other learning. So this is Kenwick today, Kenwick Hill, which is now the site of Britain's tallest war memorial. And I threw this in here because it's still, in fact, operating as a locus for memorial and memory, just sort of very different ones. And in the 15th century, this mention of Kenwick would have evoked the killing of the Jews and the martyring of a local saint. And an offering to hang Avarice all over again at Kenwick. Mundus is really trying to aggressively access the audience's cultural geographic archive to sort of connect this allegorized sin directly to the Jewish people, and sort of the local geography that's being used to help explain a global geography and fill in the map. Taken together then, the play's elements, its staging, its dramatic movement, its allegorical characters all point to a closer connection between castle perseverance and medieval map making than has been previously assumed. It isn't just that the play's diagram looks like a map. We can read the entirety of a play as a piece of didactic cartography, teaching moral geographies of the world and the run of human history. It's not just a map for a few, a wealthy few. This is a map for everybody, performed out in the open. I said earlier that I prefer to think that the playgoers were actually on the plataea itself, even though this would create some logistical problems, because this makes them part of the living map. It would have brought the world home to them in some really interesting ways, and let them see themselves in the world, in sort of the globe of the world, and maybe help them, like Augustine, to see the world in themselves. So, for good or ill, medieval people weren't walking around with maps in their pockets, and no one was trying to sell them things based on their GPS history. And they thought about maps differently than we do. But the maps mattered. Medieval people could and did think in global terms. Across barriers of class and education, they could take the imagined spaces of the world as tools for memory and morality and identity. And there were more maps to help them do this than you would think. Maps drawn on parchment, maps scribed into words, maps acted out under the bright blue sky. Medieval people may not have been as map literate as you or I, but they certainly had their own cartographic vernacular. Thank you very much.